Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, and welcome to the Nelson Arts Festival's inaugural live stream session, The Mirror Book, featuring Charlotte Grimshaw in conversation with Miro Bilbrough. Ko Kerry Sunderland toka whenua. My name is Kerry Sunderland, and I'm the coordinator of Pukapuka Talks, the Nelson Arts Festival's literary program. I was born and raised in Bunurong country in Victoria, Australia, and spent quite a lot of time, 12 years, living in Minjimble country on the far north coast of New South Wales, before moving to Aotearoa, New Zealand at the end of 2012. I acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all these lands and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. While I now live near Motueka, I'm presently sitting in Whakatu Nelson in the lovely Theatre Royal, where we've set up a pop-up studio to bring this broadcast to you today. The whole of the Nelson Arts Festival team is committed to ensuring this event is as inclusive as possible. So today we're being joined by two New Zealand sign language interpreters, Shosh and Kelly from Platform Interpreting. For those of you listening rather than watching today, I am an Australian woman with long wavy hair. I'm wearing a dark green shirt and I'm in front of a green background. I use the pronouns she and her. Before I introduce the two authors who will kōrero today, I'd also like to quickly cover a few housekeeping things. So if you're watching this session live, that is from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. on Friday, October 22nd, we will be welcoming your questions towards the end of the session. So if you have a question, note it down, or even better, pop it in the chat window in YouTube, in this YouTube stream, straight away, and we'll get to them later in the show. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the chair of today's session, Miro Bilbrough, who lives and works in Sydney, Australia. Miro, who was born in Aotearoa, New Zealand, writes poetry, makes films, and her debut book, In the Time of the Manaroans, was published by Victoria University Press in 2020. Of course, we'll be having a live stream about that book on Monday at October 25th at 11 a.m. New Zealand time. However, now it's time for me to disappear off the screen and through the marvels of technology, Miro and Charlotte will soon emerge from cyberspace and appear here with us. Thank you. They're coming. Cyberspace is busy at the moment. Okay, great.
Should I start now? Kerry, I can start. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this place we now call Sydney, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. My name is Miro Bilbrough. I'm moderating this session today with Charlotte Grimshaw. And for those of you who are listening rather than watching, I'm a Pākehā person with shoulder-length silver hair, and I'm wearing a wine dress, and I'm sitting at my front room desk. My pronouns are she and her. My guest, the writer Charlotte Grimshaw, is also a Pākehā person with shoulder-length brown hair, wearing a dark top, and she's sitting in front of a bed and a painting in a white room in her house in Auckland, and her pronouns are she and her. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you. Kia ora.
It's great
to be here.
Yeah, me too.
Zooming,
yes. Zooming. And welcome to the audience. So we're here today, as you know, to talk about the Mirror Book, the memoir, which was released earlier this year and really set New Zealand's literary world abuzz with its frank revelations about the private lives of one of New Zealand's most famous literary families, Charlotte being the daughter of the author and critic and poet C.K. Stead. But Charlotte, of course, is a critically acclaimed author in her own right, having won numerous awards and competitions for both novels and short stories. She is also an accomplished and award-winning book reviewer. So, Charlotte, immersed in the Miro book's riveting deconstruction of family relationships, I was struck by writer-daughter Charlotte's core need to solve the problem of deep parental ambivalence. Shakespearean, a psychologist in your book, you quote as calling the family dynamic Shakespearean. And I was struck, as I read, that this quest of yours is also driven by and embodied in your formidable skills as a writer. As I read, I was struck by your former lawyerliness, your narrative focus and drive, your talent for reading and blowing the subtext, your perfectionism, your reader's erudition, your bravery, your vulnerability, taboo breaking, your cruel comedy, and your self-dobbing too. I think that the narrator's intelligence is a force to be reckoned with, and that this book is a kind of reckoning. And I'd like to hold it up here for everyone to see, the Miro book. Would you read us something from it?
I would. We're reading now, are we? For sure, certainly. Thank you very much, by the way. That's an incredibly kind, lovely, kind introduction. Too kind. When we spoke, you did. I noted that you said that you wanted, or you were thinking in terms of mothers and daughters. And so, I was looking through the book, and I was thinking, of your suggestions. So I have picked something that does relate to, very brief reading relating to mothers and daughters. Writing Mazarine, I made the daughter character adopted. In the story Daughters, I made Rania a stepmother. It was a retreat from facing a subject squarely. An adoptive mother or a stepmother, too easy. It's classic. A stepmother is almost expected to be wicked since there's no blood tie. A stepmother's hostility is natural. A mother is different. You are her and she is you. She can't be accused of anything without the accusation falling back on you. If she is unkind in the Shakespearean sense, then you are unnatural and unkind because she made you. It's unnatural and unkind to name the problem or discuss it at all. It's a dilemma, and an interesting one for a writer, too interesting. I think of Sylvia Plath's vehement, disgusted rejection of her mother in the poem Medusa, and the ambiguity of the poem's final line, there is nothing between us, which I read as simultaneously a repudiation, there is no relationship, no basis for us to be together, and an acknowledgement of stifling closeness. Nothing lies between us, we could almost be one. And I picture a photograph taken by Marty Friedlander, one of many she took of me and Kay. In it, I am a baby, aged about 3 months. Whenever I've shown it, people have assumed it's not of me and Kay, but of me and my daughter, Madeline. We are that alike, it seems. These days, I sometimes hear my mother's intonation in my own voice. I remember a small hotel room in Rome. Paul was kneeling by the bed, zipping up Madeline's ski suit. Winter light was flooding through the window, and pigeons were crowding on the ledge outside. Conrad came towards me, doing up the buttons on his coat. Paul said something, and I laughed. There was a blue and gold framed mirror on the wall, and I saw myself turn and make a particular hand gesture. I jumped up, startled. I thought, there's Kay. There is nothing between us. There is nothing between us. You could look in a mirror and catch sight of her. The tie between mother and child can be so close you could call violence towards a child a terrible form of self-harm. But we are separate individuals with free choice and agency. In terms of behaviour, what lies between automatic cause and effect, between having evil done and doing it in return, is free will. This was the basis for my interest in free will. I wanted to break out of learned behaviour. There was a space between me and Kay. There was something, not nothing, between us. It was the exchange at the party that made me see that in our literary family, writing was the correct, the acceptable response. If Kay's distress over Carl's affairs and her confiding in me about it, and my years of listening to her and empathizing, if now that memory of mine was not real, and if in our family we believed so firmly in a minimum of piety that she and I were ourselves not mother and daughter, but just another two souls, and Carl and I the same, and the only thing that mattered was, as she would put it, what's on the page, then I didn't think she would object to my putting us there. She wanted to triumph and she did not want to disappear. And so I would honour that by taking out the diary pieces I'd worked on, recording fragments of our lives. I would put them together, finish them, and name my account for her enigmatic image, the ghost self from long ago, lit by winter sun, framed in a blue and gold mirror.
Brilliant, thank you. Great. There's actually a lot there that I'm going to circle back towards. So thank you for your choice. It feels really apt. Yeah. So in the Mirror book, you do very consciously set aside the family trade of fictionalization and its sublimations. It's material. Go and make a story out of it, says your father Carl, right through the memoir, and it's a mantra that your mother Kay echoes. And you get this feeling that this stock riposte for dealing with difficult experience, it's more than a creative ethos, it's a kind of way of being. And you track in the book how this led you to cultivate your trade as a novelist. It actually reminded me of the way my father, the writer Norman Bilbrough, used to enjoin me to get my feelings down on paper. And my father was an advocate of feelings, but increasingly the written down ones were the ones that were preferred, something that I too came to find very frustrating in my 40s. Can you tell us what triggered a shift from writing those novels and linked short stories to this frank, active memoir? What was the trigger? This shift in methodology.
Well, I suppose the trigger, I've attributed it to a sort of personal crisis where, everything suddenly went wrong in my life. And I realized that that normal sort of way of coping, it's material, go and make a story of it, suddenly wasn't working for me. But also it was more than that. It was that I wanted to understand a whole lot of mysteries about myself and about the family. And then I ran into this roadblock, which it seemed to me was related to this sort of ethos and way of dealing with the world. And, I call it in the book a wall of fiction. I ran into a wall of fiction. So I wanted to understand how I'd got to be in this sort of position, sort of a psychological position. And I found that there was such a degree of fictionalization within our family that I couldn't get to the real. And so that was the driving force. I was absolutely blocked from getting to anything that seemed to me to be factual, I could say broadly. So that in itself became a mystery, and then I, as a result of sorting myself out, I came sort of to understand more that this was a sort of modus operandi within the family, and it was interesting. I found it interesting in a sort of detached way of a writer. Where you've always got an eye to what's interesting and what you could write about, but also it was a mystery. It was a genuine mystery to me, and so that was the driving force, was to understand the mystery of our family, and also how I had come to be in middle age. So weird in so many ways. As many of us discover, we had no idea we were this weird.
Seems to hit in middle age, doesn't it? The mirror on one's weirdness. Yeah. And why? And I thought in our family it was a bit more extreme. I don't know whether, can you make that comparison? But that was what led me to write the book. Okay, great, thank you. You do say, and you sort of actually discuss that question in the book in so many different ways, the sort of what the quest is and this desire to understand. And in one of those sections you say, I was trying to save myself, you write, which is a powerful line. I think perhaps you've answered that. Perhaps you were trying to save yourself. I don't know, I was going to say what from, but maybe it's the wall of fiction.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, no, you may have answered it though. So,
well, I felt that I was really at such a crisis point that I was saving myself because I felt in despair. I really did feel despair. It was a genuine crisis, and I thought this is unsurvivably weird and dreadful. And I've got to try and change myself or find out what's gone wrong here. I mean, it was it was a very mundane crisis where I had my marriage, effectively blew up, which is a thing that many people experience. But I discovered that my reaction to it seemed to be way out of the norm. That was the first thing, and then it went from there, really.
Okay.
This
Yes.
Weirdness. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I actually want to come back to that, but first of all, just to sort of give a bit more background for those in the audience that haven't read about your family culture, really. The first half of the Miro book, which is almost the parental scaffolding and childhood, is very sort of rich in unsupervised play and rambling that you and your brother and sister participate from a really young age. The mangrovey tidal line of Parnell and the wilder shores and gorges of the Waitakeries, form a story world that's kind of marked with exhilaration and physical daring and peril. And it's a world from which adults, and notably your parents, are mostly missing. And when you get home, they minimize the dangers. Again, it's in favor of storytelling, and it makes a good story. And it struck a chord for me. I thought, that many of us growing up in the 60s and 70s experienced really permissive philosophies about the freedom and agency of the child, sort of a lack of parameters. And if you had artist parents, perhaps it was even more so, sort of hell-bent on their own art. But a compelling sort of portrait alongside that emerges of your very self-reliant and, I thought, kind of defiantly restless nature. And there's two lovely scenes in the book that really just embodied that for me, little vignettes. There's a photograph of you at 2 by the photographer Marty Friedlander, and you write that it's possible to see a box of matches in your muddy paw. So you're 2 and you're already playing with fire. And then at the same age, you write that one day you entered the house and you're commanded by Carl to go outside and wipe your shoes on the doormat. And you already have wiped. Do it again, he said. It was his tone that was the spark that lit the fire in my tiny mind, you write. So you went to the muddiest patch of the garden, you stomped in it, and you squelched back in without wiping. Is it any surprise that you went on to study law at Auckland University before becoming a practicing criminal lawyer? Might be a long bow, but I wanted to ask how your drive to question and to talk back, which you can sort of see almost in those images, has defined who you are and your life choices.
Yes, I think that if you take that particular anecdote, which is that where I was told to wipe my feet, and it was the sort of managerial and bossy tone lit the fire in my tiny mind, or whatever it is. I think perhaps the fact that I grew up with my father, Carl C.K. Stead, who is famously fierce, ferocious, and combative and clever and articulate. I found that I didn't tend to wilt I tended to be defiant. So from a very early age, so I recall that from a very early age, I defied his edict. And I think that probably was formative in that it made me, I was never afraid of anyone really. So I guess it was in that sense, I was not a timid person because I'd had a lot of experience of being defiant with Carl. But also I think perhaps intellectually as well, and temperamentally, I tended towards wanting to question authority, wanting to know why I was being told to do something, all that sort of thing, which of course led me, I wanted to study law. Partly I wanted to study law actually because I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to sort of follow in anyone's footsteps, and no one else in the family had studied law. So I thought that would be, and I also thought it would be fascinating, which it was. And I love the criminal law because, of course, the stories, the drama, the complexity of the criminal law, and I still love going to high court trials and things like that. I'm really interested in the criminal law still. So, but I think, I think it's perhaps growing up with in an atmosphere of sort of combative, just combat, but also intellectual combat was probably useful, for the law. But then, of course, I went back to literature because that was really my true nature. I mean, I used to sit in my office. I worked at Simpson Grierson as well, a big commercial firm, and I used to sit in my office and read novels at Simpson Grierson when I was meant to be researching the Carriage of Goods Act or something intensely boring like that. So I did gravitate back to my roots,
Interesting. Yes, you write, is perhaps a great grounding for a novelist. You write somewhere that your experience of criminal law and of reading cases and taught you that we are all, that we can, I can't remember how you put it, but it was something, just we're all a step away from murder, or murder can happen it's a sort of a slippery slope. It's you, in a way, you take the drama out of it, you make it, empathic is the word, but it's a deeper understanding of human nature and its extremes that law seems to show you.
Yeah, or perhaps it's more that we're all a product of our environment, and I'm always wondering how much free will people really have. If you grow up, for example, in really deprived and violent circumstances, how much free will do you really have to go on to be a good citizen? Your choices are pretty narrow. So my idea is always, I would like to think a humane one about that sort of thing, because people's choices are narrower than your sort of stern moralist might think, I would say. So maybe not so much we're all a step away from murder. I suppose we might be, but more, how much choice do we have in terms of, I think we do, because that was in my extract, was about free will that I just read.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And coaching yourself in it through the book. So just circling back, a kind of counterpoint to that assertive Charlotte that we've been talking about was the silence. You write about a silence that came over you at 13 that was your norm for a while. And much later in your life, the self-silencing morphs into what you call the mind alone, a sensation, which you experience after your husband leaves you temporarily. But you notice that the sensation is not new. And I found the mind alone in your naming of this experience quite courageous and also deeply recognizable. And I wondered if for the audience, again, who doesn't know this term, you could just define that, the mind alone.
Yeah, it's a complicated idea that I think when I started looking into the psychology of traumatic experiences, for example, and I read that a traumatic experience is made more traumatic by the sense that the mind is alone. So if you go through something really distressing, humans are social animals, and what is really beneficial is if you experience it with other people helping you, assisting you. That's one aspect of it. So trauma is deepened by the sense that the mind is alone. But also I did explore a whole lot of aspects of the silence that I descended into for quite a long time at one point. And I mean, I explore that in quite a lot of detail, because the idea of the mind being alone is really central to the book, because the book was really a process of me realizing that I was too alone. I was too geared to being alone, and trying to find out why that was, and trying to work my way to a point of being a more social animal, which would make me a much happier, more normal person. So there's a sort of back and forth in the book between the reading I did about psychology and my own experiences, and my own sense that this is a deeply significant, sort of crucial concept in the book, the mind alone, that the mind is alone. And I think it's really the answer to a lot of the difficulties that I had, really, was that I mean, having read your book, there's a lot of experiences that you had where you would seem to be ranging around fairly unconnected to, so I think you probably understand what I mean when about these sort of experiences that you have in your life where you're genuinely alone, and there's something actually traumatic about that in itself, perhaps.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, it's I think that your book named something that I had become conscious of, in midlife.
Right.
And it was a real epiphany for me. I knew the feeling. I had been approaching it in the same way that you were consciously, but I didn't exactly have, I didn't have the official term for it. So
yeah, well, I mean, there is a kind of distress, a deep distress that, like becomes in some case, can become like a person with, say, borderline personality, which I got interested in. I read about Sylvia Plath, but I also read a lot of psychology stuff where that's central to that sort of distress.
Yes.
The mind.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So it's complicated. You have to read the book.
You do. You have to. Yes. And there's something, it is a terrifying concept, but I think Charlotte writes about it in a way that it's just really good to have it named. I just found it great to have it named. It takes some of the sting from it, in a sense, to know that it's a phenomenon, that it's human, that it's real, that it's yes. But I mean,
I'm pleased to hear that, because I was grateful to read about these things and find that there is an explanation for this sort of. It's not just a sort of a black hole of weirdness. It's all explicable. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, I totally agree. The naming has a kind of power. But your book made me wonder. It made me think, gosh, because I can remember saying to a real sort of hard drinking party animal, social animal poet friend, oh, I write to keep myself company. And it's sort of a joke, but we both agreed that's what we did. And she said, oh, I do too. And I was talking in a much deeper sense. And I think that your book made me wonder, do most writers do this? Is this what we do, actually, that many writers are perhaps writing into the mind alone?
Yeah, and perhaps to make sense of perhaps in the course of putting it down on paper, just as in the course of verbalizing, you can actually you can find your way towards a kind of truth that makes sense. So writing down your experiences is a way of, you could call it keeping yourself company, or you could call it making sense of what you've experienced, and then sharing it. I mean, if anyone, people, you find that people are interested in when you make a story. If you make it interesting and enough, they'll enjoy it. So I guess another way of looking at it is you're keeping yourself company by drawing people into your either your story or the thing that you're trying to explain to them.
Yes, you're actually, and that struck me in your book too. And it was sort of a question I had for you. Does writing into the mind alone, conversely, it brings community? It can bring reading.
Well, you hope it does, unless it's really boring or it's a terrible story or something. But so that's what you're kind of hoping, that people will read it and that in a way they'll share some of the knowledge in it, or they'll recognize stuff in it. They'll think, yes, I understand that, or and also you want it to be an entertainment for them, and that it's a page-turning story. So all that, you're trying to share something. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's multiple drives, aren't there? I mean, you write, and often quite contradictory ones. I think there's a moment in my memoir, and it sounds like poetic fancy, but I live in an apartment, and I found myself writing after a very pleasurable day that I sometimes my writing was like a garden that I wandered in, and the words had that sort of a lushness or a fertile space. So sometimes I write to make gardens. And Carl says in your book that he writes to create order and beauty. Interestingly, you also read that as a subtextual drive to control experience.
Yes, and I mean, he expressly says that. He talks about the peace that comes with writing a good poem, and he talks about that the world is, I can't remember the exact quote, but the world is not orderly and beautiful, so he creates order and beauty, which I think is really touching. I mean, I completely understand that impulse, but I, of course, wickedly and disobediently also relate it to his sort of what I called airbrushing the family. So refusing to see the messy bits and
burnishing the reflection. I think you
if you look at it that way, it's not something. It's more touching if you look at it as him trying to create something orderly and beautiful out of a ghastly world. It's sort of sensitive, isn't it? I mean, so I think I see that quite sympathetically, but at the same time, I think it did have a problematic aspect because he airbrushed us too much, I think.
Great. So you also quote Janet Malcolm's "Art is armed robbery, art is theft, art is not pleasing your mother."
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it?
So a latter clause gave me 5 minutes of dispensation. But, the Mirror book pens a particularly shifting and restless portrait of Kay, and your relationship is like the mystery heart of the book for me, one that you sort of worry and orbit. It's a quest without a resolution. And to go back to your reading, in fact, of a mother's hostility towards a daughter, you write, "It's unnatural and unkind to name the problem or discuss it at all. It's a dilemma and an interesting one for a writer. Too interesting." I love this "too interesting." What do you mean?
Well, it is. It's too interesting in that it's a minefield, and it's a really. I suppose what I'm doing there is I'm debating with myself: is this? Can I do this? Do I dare do this? Do I go there? And of course, people. What you see is it's such a sensitive subject that it gets a really interesting response. That so many people understand it. I've never had such a reader response before, and mostly very, very warm, people really appreciating the fact that I've gone there and tried to do it in a way that's humane and not in a nasty or harsh way, but I've gone there. And other people seem to find it outrageous. I think it definitely stirs and triggers people's reactions. So there's the odd sort of online commentator will say that it's an appalling, that I'm awful. But I just find it really interesting, and I too am a mother, and I've said that I wrote the book more as a mother than as a daughter, because part of my revelation about the way I grew up sort of began to form when I had my own children. So I could make the comparison, and so I suppose some of the book is me daring, asking myself whether I dare to go there into that central mystery. And then I think, well, I have to, because it's absolutely central. And it relates to the mind, but the mind is alone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I had to go there, or the book would have been meaningless. The other debate was whether I should have published the book now, but I still think I don't regret doing that.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to keep talking to you, but I just want to put a note out for the audience. If you would like to start submitting your questions now for Charlotte, now is a good time to put them in the chat. Thank you. Yes, I think that you really sort of deconstruct and you write down the pros and cons and the doubts and the just that process of trying to approach this, what is pretty much a taboo topic. I wanted to quote a little bit of some of her qualities that you capture, because you paint a picture of it's a complex portrait of a mercurial woman, and and that's one of the book's sources of richness. You write of Kay's ability to be poleaxed by mirth, this wonderful ability, especially by your father. You write of her sense of marvelous rebellion, which just during your own growing up took in vandalism, graffiti with spray paint, minor arson, being arrested, expelled, revolt at school, any other mayhem we could come up with. In my strenuous bad girl act, I was really being a good girl, you write. Can you unpack that contrary logic for the audience? Just a little bit more.
Yeah, well, girls are eager to please, and I don't know, I think maybe we had roles in our family, and I stepped into the rebel role and filled it with gusto. So I was the worst and the baddest and the wickedest in some ways, although I've censored some of my siblings. terrible, a lot of, anyway, I won't go there with the siblings, but I was in the role of the rebel, and the thing, and so I had a lot of fun, but it got more and more and more I think destructive. It got damaging, because if you play those kind of games when you're a teenager, it's just, you're going to get into a dark place, really. And I think that dark place was lack of self-esteem and shame. So it wasn't really funny after a while, and
you had a great audience in a sense, but
but it was destructive. And but the thing that was I found really strange, and I've written about it in the book, was that I was really interested in being academically successful. I really wanted to do well at school, and I could create all sorts of mayhem but still pass my exams. I seemed to be able to multitask between terrible rebellion and schoolwork. But the idea that you would encourage a young person to drop out, that is a real mystery to me. If I think of my own children, to encourage a young person to that school is a load of bullshit seems to me to be extraordinarily
I would like to offer something up there, actually, because 2 generations of women in my family also lionized that kind of rebellion, and in fact, to be good at school was seen, you were actually mediocre if you were good at school. I was good at school, and it was a kind of conformism.
Conformity.
It was the 70s, and those ideas were quite strong.
Partly the times,
the anti-authoritarian New Zealand streak that now I live in Australia, I see ever clearer, and in my own character. And the fact that your mother and my mother and my grandmother all left school very young. So maybe there was a sense of the daughter not overtaking.
Well,
mother, because it was clearly a difficult. There was some sort of there's deep ambivalence there, isn't there? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, obviously, the school, education is a way of arming yourself against the world, isn't it? So obviously, it's a way of if someone's messing with that. There's all sorts of reasons. I mean, partly it's the generational thing of the rebellion, the that sort of time, the 70s. But also, I mean, there are people to this day, aren't there, who are not educated and sort of say that they, you know, they get by on common sense, and
there's different kinds,
and that they sort of scorn the idea of education. So
there are different
a
kinds
mysterious one.
Different kinds of intelligence too, I think. You know, I mean, there are people that the school system really doesn't suit. I really saw
definitely,
in my family really clearly. I have, you know, just a welter of more questions, but in actual fact, we're heading towards time, and it would be lovely to hear you read something else.
Sure.
If you would like to.
Yeah.
Because then
if you want me to.
Yes, I'd love you to, because then we'll open up to the audience questions.
Okay. So it's this book, it's really hard to know, because it's such all of a piece, it's really hard to know to pick a discrete piece to read. So I'll just read this is a brief piece. I'd spent a long time thinking about family and place and family. When Paul's elderly mother, Audrey, died during the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, it so happened I'd just been asked by the Sunday Star Times to write a very short story imagining the end of New Zealand's level 4 lockdown. Even though the space allowed was so tiny, it was an opportunity to write a tribute to Audrey, and I grabbed it after lockdown. When George and Audrey talked about emigrating, he wanted to become a farmer. He'd signed up for the war underage and had been at the liberation of Changi. He'd travelled and got a taste for it. And while Audrey barely knew how to read a map and hadn't been anywhere, she trusted his ideas. So they left grim post-war Manchester and sailed to New Zealand. After that, George said, "I'm never going home." They found work and started exploring the country, venturing further until one summer they made their way to a rural settlement in the far north. They kept going past beaches and a marae, where the road became a dead end. Here at the edge of Doubtless Bay was a small wooden house. It was getting dark. Audrey was doubtful, but George said, "Look, the gate's open." He knocked and asked if they could camp on the land. The house belonged to Pawhau and Roma Rupapara, and that summer began a friendship that lasted the rest of their lives. They camped at the Rupaparas every holiday until they could build a batch nearby. George and Pawhau fished together. Audrey and Roma sat talking under the Pahutakawa at Whakawhiwhi Beach. They called this putting the world to rights. Over the years, the families grew close. The children all played together. Roma was a respected kuia, mother of 9. She and Audrey were both churchgoers, upright, community-minded. You could see them under the tree beside Auntie Song's batch, a house no bigger than a large packing crate, airing their opinions on the world. Audrey solemn, her back straight, talking in her thick Mancunian accent. Roma grand and slyly humorous in her leopard print hat. When George died, the Rupaparas came to Auckland. Roma told Audrey, "We've come to take George home." After his tangi on the marae, George was buried in the Maori graveyard on the hill at Whakawhiwhi. From there, you can watch the currents sweeping across the water, the gannets diving like missiles into the sea. Audrey lived on in Auckland. She spent time with her devoted daughter Jane, with her grandchildren. She went faithfully to St Barnabas Church in Mount Eden. She knew all the church controversies, the scandals. Asked to comment, she'd turn discreet, priestly. On rare occasions, she'd cut loose, revealing a sense of humour so rich you marvelled at the self-control it must take to conceal it. She started to struggle and grew frail. She passed out and was rescued by her neighbour. In hospital, she said, "See that bed over there? There's been a fire burning on it all day." She moved to a rest home. 2 days into the level 4 lockdown, Audrey had a turn. A doctor came. It was best, he said, that she stay where she was. It would not be long. Level 4 imposed its rules, one visitor at a time, only 15 minutes at a time. Only her children could visit. No grandchildren, no touching, stay 2 meters away. As she lay dying, first her son, then her daughter spoke to her across the room. Her elder son, the paramedic, was in lockdown in the far north. Her children couldn't gather at the bedside, couldn't meet after she died. There could be no last visit at the funeral parlour, no funeral. There was only this promise, after lockdown. After lockdown, she will be farewelled at St Barnabas. After lockdown, she will travel north one last time, to join George on the hill at Wharafifi in sight of Doubtless Bay. After lockdown, the gate is open and Audrey Grimshaw will go home.
Beautiful, thank you. Well, I'm actually going to throw open to the audience. There's a lot of questions in the chat, so I will choose a few for you, Charlotte. Yes, well, this is an interesting one. You describe in the book your realization about the lack of close female friendships in your life, and this person asks, can you talk a little bit about how that might have changed since? Or my question, I guess, would be, has the journey of the book affected that? How has the journey of the book affected that?
Well, it really has, in that I changed myself. So when I say I changed my brain in the book, I really mean that. So my whole outlook changed. I became a much more open and friendly person, and the way that I looked at the world and at women completely changed, which is just so. That's why I sort of say I had to write about it. And I've had wonderful communications from many women who, you know, have sort of said, well, for one thing was that a lot of people thought that I was frosty. I was frosty and aloof, someone said. So, you know, I'd always been frosty and aloof. And I think a lot of people seemed to quite like the idea that actually I wasn't frosty and aloof. It was just that, you know, I was a bit odd. So it has definitely changed for me. It's a work in progress, of course. You know, I'm still still fairly weird, but it has definitely changed. And one thing I've discovered, until we had the lockdown, which was so frustrating, I was loving meeting readers who were telling me. One thing is that the book seems to encourage people to share things about their own family dynamic, and I just was enjoying that so much, and meeting people at book events and in all sorts of places, in the park with my dog, and then we got locked down. So it's a work in progress, but it has definitely changed, is the answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very struck in the book. Your frankness about that. You said, I didn't know how to find friends. Women spoke a foreign language. I could neither read their signals nor feel certain I was using the right words. It's an invitation in a way. It's a appeal, that kind of nakedness, I think. I don't know. It's moving. It's open. That kind of honesty. It's
also totally at odds from my usual way my whole life. You know, I was not open. I was the opposite. So
what else? So another question is, how do you feel about writing fiction again now? And in fact, I was curious to know, can you go back to it, or do you feel, you know, a life is pretty inexhaustible? Is there more memoir to mine?
Well, I've definitely thought of writing more nonfiction about this experience. Definitely, and I've been reading a lot of nonfiction. So there's that. I also am finding myself brewing up to new fiction as well, because there was one point where I thought to myself, you know, I have this really careful, worked out mode of writing, which involves my sort of solitary ways and all that kind of thing. Am I going to kill it off? But am I going to become this wonderfully well-adjusted person who can't write anymore? And, you know, I've killed off the formula, the secret formula. And I definitely worried about that. But and, you know, time will tell. I may become a complete dud as a writer. You know, I might be really, really well adjusted and a really boring writer. We shall see. But I'm working up to more nonfiction. But I can see I have a whole notebook full of short stories, for example. So I'm definitely working on fiction as well. And I think it'll work. Should work. Yeah.
Okay. Another question here is, you described your behavior as disobedient and wicked. Since publication of the book, has there been either a request for forgiveness or have you been explicitly forgiven? Has there been either a request for forgiveness
from the family?
I guess it doesn't say, but I guess that's
no.
Okay.
There's not been no. And it was interesting too. I had written about some really traumatic experiences that I hadn't shared with the family, and so it was interesting to get the reaction, which was certainly not warm. They were not pleased, and there was no engagement with talking about the traumatic experiences that I had never told anyone. I'm completely interested in having a nice family, the nice extended family that we've always had, and I think that we actually, we're so simpatico in so many ways that really the only way is up. Even if they were pissed off, we're still very together, I think.
Mm.
So, but definitely no one's asked for forgiveness on either. I suppose I have. Well, at the same,
writing the book, for writing.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, but I'm going to do it, sort of thing. But not from the other side. No.
So I guess related to that, the next question is, now that you have published the book, do you feel that you've put those feelings and frustrations that in a sense we've just been talking about, do you feel you've put them to bed? So has it done the healing rather than getting it explicitly from them, but actually simply the process?
Yeah, I think for me, it's been a terrific experience, because to have published it and to feel that it's right and accurate as best I could, and then to get the reader reaction, which there are some people who are negative about it, but the overwhelming reaction has been really positive. And to me, that's wonderful, because I feel that I've put something out there, and a lot of people have understood what I'm trying to get at, and they have also related it to their own experience. And I'm really pleased about that, because I could have published it and people could have, said to me, well, this is nonsense, or you're nuts, or, F off, or but so it's been a really really positive experience, as well as harrowing, but positive. Yeah. So yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, yes, you can never predict reception. So was there a kind of a harrowing period when I've heard you saying that you did take a lot out of the book, and you must have been also waiting to see how it landed.
Yeah, and it didn't land well with the family, but as I said to someone, it was more than twice as long when I had finished it, and I spent ages just cutting stuff out. So it's heavily censored. It's the opposite of exaggerated. It's really censored. and so sorry, I slightly lost the thread there, but
no, that's interesting. Well, I'm going to change tack a little bit, actually, and go back to a question I didn't get to ask you, but you quote in the book Catherine Mansfield's term. I don't know if it originates with her, but you've read it in her writing, shipboard weather, and you use it to describe, because your book has a very sort of, I guess, novelistic kind of sensitivity to climate and weather and geography, which I really enjoyed. And you use this term to describe the dynamic openness of the climate of Auckland that you grew up in. You say nature is always breaking in, rocking the sagging fences, sweeping across the ramshackle landscape. Now I found this dynamic openness terrific, like a tonic. And I thought, well, gosh, the shipboard weather of Auckland is also the emotional and psychological weather of the book. It really does seem to capture that. And so I just was curious about you and psychogeography and the way landscape reflects you back at yourself, and has that always been part of you your writing? Is that important?
Yeah, I think I describe myself as a 5-year-old, saying I was always a sucker for beauty. I was always impressed by landscape and light and weather, and I think that passage that you're describing, it may be when we came back from London, and I was so exhilarated by New Zealand, and Auckland was this ramshackle, sprawling, messy, lush place, and I was just so excited to be back, and it was so beautiful. New Zealand, I mean, one says sort of inanely, New Zealand is so beautiful, but my God, when you've been out of New Zealand for a while, when you come back, you're so struck by it. And of course, there's always the psychological weather as well. Yeah, so of course the stormy children in the stormy landscape. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, it really puts you as the reader in the story. Sorry, I'm just checking. Looks like there's another question. No, it wasn't. It was just we're nearly done for time. Actually, reading your descriptions of Parnell, and I was really transported there, and I recently rediscovered that visiting, because I went to Parnell School with your brother Oliver very, very briefly, and so I particularly enjoyed trekking round that landscape with you in the book. I'm just wondering if I've got 2 more minutes, if we can embark on anything. Yeah, I think, how much time have we got? We've got 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to say that there was one moment in the book when I got about halfway through and I thought, I really related to it. I thought Charlotte at this point is the good daughter, trying to understand, to make a complex personality add up in a way that it ultimately won't add up. I put the narrator's attempt to reconcile with the unreconcilable reminded me of myself, and I wanted to say to you, I don't believe you can solve this with logic. And I thought, is this the impossible brief of the memoirist, to make experience, or in this case, a mother's character, add up, and realize it won't?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be logic, is it? It's a portrait. So it's going to be, it's not fiction, but it's a descriptive portrayal is going to maybe, there's that thing that the artist's duty is to ask the questions, to ask the right questions. It is the artist's duty to ask the right questions. And so perhaps it's a portrayal that asks questions rather than the idea that you would use logic to work someone out, which I don't think you can ever do, and that's why people are a mystery, and they're maddening and they're wonderful. And so you make a portrait and you hope that you've asked the right questions.
Yes, exactly.
What a wonderful place to end. I want to say a huge here. Thank you to both Charlotte Grimshaw and Miro Bilbrough. That was it was kind of like the 21st century equivalent of being fly on the wall, I think, listening to your conversation today. I also want to say a big thank you to Nelson City Council, who's the festival's core funder. I encourage you to go out and buy the Mirror book, but not only the Mirror book, perhaps also Mazarine and Opportunity, because I really enjoyed rereading both of them after reading the Mirror book and seeing where Charlotte's real life had made its way into fiction. And of course, if you're in Whakatu Nelson, please head down to our local bookstore, Page and Blackmore, who's the sponsor of the festival and would have been selling the book had we gone ahead in person. A little reminder that we've got another live stream session on Monday morning at 11 a.m. New Zealand time, and that's with Miro back, and she'll be on the other side of the hot seat on Monday, being interviewed about her book In the Time of the Manaroans. It's 11 o'clock on Monday, October 25. And last but not least, I'd love to give a little plug for our Writing Home project. It's an on-demand digital project, and our first video is now live, and you can find it on the Nelson Arts Festival's YouTube channel and also on our website, which is nelsonartsfestival.nz. Thanks to all the team here for making this happen, and look forward to seeing you again on Monday morning. And mā te wā. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.